Hi everyone, my name is Ramlah Iqbal and I am the temporary team lead for the Temporary Foreign Workers Program at the Saskatoon Open Door Society. Welcome to today's talk in Threads Cultural Conversation on Migrant Workers or Temporary Foreign Workers. We are glad to have with us Professor Boucher from the University of Sydney. Hello, Dr. Boucher.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you too. Thank you for taking out the time to do this talk with us. It's a great pleasure having you here. So before we go into detail and talk about temporary foreign workers, the challenges they face and other things, I feel it's important for the audience to know who is a migrant worker. So migrant worker or temporary foreign worker is anyone who comes to Canada on a work permit. It can be a closed work permit, meaning that it is tied to a specific employer, or it can be an open work permit, meaning it gives them the flexibility to change employers, or they can also come to Canada under the seasonal agricultural program. So as you can notice, temporary foreign workers or migrant workers coming to Canada under the seasonal agricultural program contribute immensely to Canada's economy. They're actually the backbone of Canada's industrial industry. They help farmers grow crops, harvest crops at the right time, and the apple sitting in your kitchen counter is the hard work and labor of a temporary foreign worker. So with this brief introduction and the role that they play in Canada's economy, it's interesting to note that despite all the increased amount of work that they do to help us grow and prosper, these workers face immense challenges in their struggle to settle down and find work here. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the struggles that they go through and the challenges that they face. It is because of the language barriers that they face, because many of them come from countries where the first language is not English. Many of them come from Latin American countries. So for them, communication is a major barrier. Also, because many of them have visas tied to specific employers, this puts them at risk for employer exploitation. Also, cultural shock and cultural adjustment is a major barrier for many of them. Accessing services as well, because of the temporary nature of their visas, many of them cannot access services that are available to many other people on permanent residence. So with this brief introduction about migrant workers and the challenges they face, I'm going to shift the conversation towards Anna. So Anna, you have done a lot of work. You have published a book on about temporary foreign workers, patterns of exploitation. So from your perspective, how do you feel? How come they are so susceptible? And what's the pattern of exploitation?
So the book actually doesn't just cover temporary foreign workers, it covers all migrants, because I work from the assumption that all migrants have the potential to work, including undocumented migrants and tourists. But certainly temporary foreign workers and their equivalent in other countries are overrepresented in these patterns of exploitation that I expose in the book. The book looks at 907 court cases brought by migrant workers, brought by about 2,600 workers in 4 countries, of which Canada is one. The others are Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, focusing on the state of California. And what I find in my book is that the central biggest factor that is driving those patterns of exploitation is, in fact, the labour system of the country. So the labour system can either be protective or not protective of migrant workers. And Canada is a bit of a mixed bag. And you have variation across your provinces in the extent of labour and employment protections, not just for migrant workers, but for Canadians as well. And so that level of protection is important in terms of whether migrants can bring cases or not. Another important factor is the visa, which you've touched on. And a lot of advocates talk about variation in visa design and making small changes in temporary visas to protect workers more or less. What I find is that generally temporality it creates risks for workers. So yes, there can be improvements, but the overall issue is whether there is the potential to convert to permanent residency, which you've touched on, that for a lot of the what might be called low wage visas in Canada, and this is true in other countries as well, there are often not that many pathways to permanent residency. And it's that fact that often renders migrants more at risk of exploitation too.
What do you think, what forms of discriminations do temporary foreign workers are, most exposed to? And again, is there like a factor that you can relate to?
So in my book, I do look at all the different forms of discrimination, race discrimination, discrimination based on ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, parenting arrangements, so on, age discrimination. By far the most common are gender and race across the countries. Some countries have better legal frameworks for bringing discrimination cases. So Canada has, in some of its provinces, quite robust human rights codes. The United Kingdom has the Human Rights Act and other bases to bring discrimination cases. Under EU law, that's less the case in Australia, and in California, it might be through civil rights provisions. So race discrimination comes out as a very common feature. Often migrants who even bring wage claims could probably bring a discrimination claim as well, but they don't always, simply because they bring the claim maybe that will have the most compensation or the easiest to run. And discrimination claims can be quite hard to run. What I've also seen is what I call intersectional discrimination. So, for instance, a woman of colour or visible minority also being discriminated on the basis of her gender. And it varies across countries. In some countries, such as Canada, in some provinces, it is possible to bring both claims at the same time and to dispute both forms of discrimination. But in others, such as Australia, it's basically impossible. So that compounding form of discrimination is not unusual. And my new research is looking at how particularly those women may also experience, aside from wage claims and wage underpayment and things like that, they may also experience either sexual harassment or even sexual assault in the workplace. So looking not only at discrimination in terms of the attributes of the migrant, but also what kind of experiences they might have. I will say on the question of discrimination that one of the challenges with my research is that it only looks at migrants. So an interesting question is, once someone stops being a migrant from a visa perspective, for instance, becomes a citizen, but they're still a racialised minority, are they still experiencing the discrimination at the same rate? Is it the visa status or the person's attributes or both that is causing the discrimination? And does discrimination shift over a person's life course depending on where they are in the immigration process? I think it's a really important empirical question that I haven't seen answered in the research so far, and that's where my research is also going in the future.
That's amazing. Interesting to know, because we've observed the same, like intersectionality. When two or more factors combine, there is more discrimination that the migrant workers may face, and it's a really interesting, we would be interested to know if the change in status helps them, decrease the incidence of discrimination, or it's just the other factors that are coming into play. So what do you think in addressing the maltreatment of migrant workers? What measures can be taken? And is there a need of improved legislation or heightened awareness?
Look, I don't think it's any one policy solution. As I said, the key finding of my book is that labour law matters. Australia has pretty good labour laws with regards to worker protections. Still here we have high rates of exploitation. So obviously ensuring there are no loopholes in the labour laws, carve-outs that fail to protect migrant workers, that would be a starting point. Strong enforcement mechanisms and funding of those mechanisms, whether we're talking about labour inspectors, funding government to bring court cases to pursue underpayment by employers, that's also really important. We know that trade union and other worker representation can be important in some instances, but it depends on the way the trade unions are involved with migrant workers, and they're not always as supportive as one would think. I found variation across the Canadian provinces in how trade unions are involved in the representation of migrant workers. And then I'm just finishing an article with some solicitors where we look at the role of community legal centres, I think you call them legal clinics in Canada, in representing migrant workers. So having funding available to public bodies to represent migrant workers and pursue enforcement of wages and other conditions when they're not met is this in this paper that I've just finished, the single biggest factor.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. I would just like to add that, fostering a culture of equity, diversity, and inclusion in our workplaces and our societies is important, and it's essential to recognize the rights and dignity of all individuals, regardless of their immigration status. Yeah, so just going to summarize, temporary foreign workers or migrant workers play an essential role in a country's economy. And although there's work being done, like as Anna said, that it's become more vocal, we still need to do a lot of work in terms of legal reforms, in terms of anti-discrimination policies, in terms of awareness campaigns, and not just at the national level. I feel international cooperation between countries to recognize the dignity and hard work, and to give equal rights, if not equal, recognize them for them, and then have them give them the value that they deserve. So through our program, the Saskatoon Open Door Society was able to advocate for the right of temporary foreign workers. Thank you so much, Anna, for your being here and for enlightening us about your work and all the amazing work that you have done for the temporary foreign workers and migrant workers. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.